since the assassination attempt of Trump on Saturday, that obviously is going to loom large, not only in this news cycle and in this election, but in American history. As we are now a couple of days out from that, do you feel like the conversation around that is getting more responsible, less responsible? It's moving on in any constructive way?
I mean, I think it depends on what audience. Obviously, there's still, a lot of like conspiracy theories, a lot of doubt, a lot of things that are going on sort of in the ether, sort of around what happened. But, I have to say that, I actually experienced that breaking news while I was at a wonderful thing called BlurredCon. It's the Black nerds, of which I am one. I like to think of myself as their princess. So I'm at BlurredCon, when we were just like chilling, like going to one of the food trucks and doing that. And that's when it started to pop into everybody's phones. Yeah. And so I had a chance to actually talk to a lot of people in real time and to get sort of people's first instant reaction. And then, of course, more reactions have been coming in, both the, I always talk about whether it's the official people or the civilians. Yeah. And whether it's civilians or officials. And then on top of it, then the news today out of Miami about, what Judge Aileen Cannon did. I will say that the kind of universal kind of reaction that I'm getting, whether it's civilians or, professionals, is really a deep concern and lack of confidence in not us at this table or us at MSNBC, but us as the media writ large. And a fear that what's going to happen now is that the Republican Party will do what they do. They're in the middle of a campaign. The convention started today. But the media will acquiesce to trying to convince people that the things they've been experiencing for the last 5-6 years didn't happen. That the greatest purveyor and promoter of political violence, really, since anyone can remember, since George Wallace, I think, that we just haven't experienced that kind of open, sort of citing or sort of incitement of violence or sort of luxuriating in the idea of violence. It's just not something we're used to anymore in American politics. And then we had to get used to that being a thing. And people are concerned and expressing concern that we won't be the guardians of memory and that we will allow Donald Trump, as he is, bathed in the glory and grandeur of his party, to rewrite himself as both a hero and a victim, that people who are the most vulnerable to not just the things he's done, but the things he's promising to do, and that will then happen without a guardian saying, wait, stop, and then the media will acquiesce to this rewrite. And the people that I've been talking to don't accept the rewrite. They still remember that this person said, get him out, I'll pay your legal fees. They still remember that Republicans like Marjorie Taylor Greene did ads where they had long guns and were firing at pictures of Nancy Pelosi and have been promoting the idea that the Democrats, the left, the liberals, it'll be peaceful, said the Heritage Foundation leader, if the left allows it. People haven't forgotten those threats. And they don't want us to forget them either. And at the same time, Donald Trump, I mean, for all the using the idea of victimization as a political trope, he is legitimately the victim of this attempt. And I was, looking back at history, looking at previous political violence in our country and all of the presidential candidates and indeed presidents who have been shot at. And, we've had 4 presidents assassinated. We've had an incredible history of political violence in this country. But one thing that's true over time, when you look back at that whole string, going all the way back to the 1800s, is that the motive of the person committing the violence is never relevant. Very true. The act of violence itself ends politics, turns it over into crime, and makes the views and the motivations of the shooter irrelevant. Everybody in politics, no matter where you are ideologically, must unite around the idea that violence is unacceptable. Absolutely. And it's unacceptable both when it comes to targeted stuff like this, but it's also unacceptable when you try to incite that as a way of getting things that you want that you can't get through political means. So it's true in terms of violent rhetoric. It's true in violence orientation toward the idea of confrontation with your fellow Americans. And of course, it's true in the case of some sort of insane event like we saw on Saturday in Pennsylvania. And I just feel like obviously we're all very grateful that President Trump was not more seriously hurt. We are all absolutely shattered by the fact that somebody was killed. Somebody was killed, 2 people were put in the hospital very seriously hurt. But
I am hoping that the one positive thing that can come out of this is some sobriety around the idea of violence in politics being no freaking joke and nothing that anybody should play with ever.
Yeah.
And you're right, you can't be ahistorical about it. And we do need to think of it as a spectrum while being completely real about the risks of this to everybody. Violence, among everything else, is very unpredictable. Once it's part of your political system, you never know which direction it's going to go.
Yeah.
Nobody can harness it in one direction only. It just doesn't work that way.
Yeah, and if I could just very quick, I don't want to monopolize the time, but, the one time I've ever been afraid doing this job, honestly, was in 2016 in Cleveland, when men, because it's an open carry state, Ohio, were pacing in front of our position with long guns, with AR-15s, in a way to menace us. As we were in our outdoor positions, they felt that they needed to send a message to us visually with their firearms. And I think about the people who tried to vote in Arizona when men with long guns were standing outside of those polling places to send them a message. You don't vote the right way. I'm here with this gun. And so the idea of political violence that we've been nursing really since then is so dangerous.
Yeah.
It's so dangerous that you cannot avoid the consequences of it, even if you're one of the people promoting it.
No, that's right. And the political system collapses under the threat of violence.
Absolutely.
Because that is the end of politics and the beginning just of the use of force.
I didn't know if we were going to be this real, but as long as we're going there, I'll say this. I've worked on a half a dozen campaigns, and I've never needed any sort of security from the other side. I mean, I worked on Republican campaigns, and I was never under any threat, verbal or physical, from any of the opposing campaigns. Since I've had this job covering the Trump movement, everyone that goes to rallies from every news organization has security. Most people who are in the public arena rely on security to protect their families. In a post-Paul Pelosi moment, you thought some circuit might trip and break. It didn't. They mocked him. They made fun of him and the circumstances around his attack. In a post-Gabby Giffords America, you thought we might have a real conversation.
In a post-Steve Scalise
and nothing has changed the conversation. It is sick and sad that Trump was targeted. It is an epic tragedy that my parents go to Trump rallies. It is an epic tragedy that someone who was there to support their candidate died protecting their family. There is nothing that can be done. There's something that can be done. There can be loud, platformed condemnation of the violence, and it doesn't come from across the ideological spectrum.
Yeah. And I will say that in this moment, I also feel like when talking about it being like, is this going to be a different type of moment? Is there going to be an outbreak of sobriety? I mean, part of that means being forgiving and soft-hearted toward people who have done the wrong thing in the past who now want to do the right thing. Right? I mean, one of the things that has happened in the wake of some of these other violent incidents is that people who have said, I've used rhetoric in the past that now when I reflect on it is not the kind of rhetoric that I'll use again. That's good. That sort of thing ought to be encouraged. We're going to see a little bit of that in the clip they've released already from President Biden speaking with Lester Holt, talking about some language that he's used in terms of targeting Trump and whether or not that could have been misconstrued by somebody, and the president engaging in some reflection about that. I mean, part of the idea here about this being a different type of moment is that we should experience some growth as a nation and that there should be self-reflection by everybody in the public arena. But that also doesn't mean we have to give up being clear-eyed about the magnitude of the threats and where they're coming from.
Exactly. I mean, and we'll talk about the clip of President Biden and him being asked about language he used, using targeted and using using language that's around gun violence, which is certainly not what he meant, I think, in that moment. But it is important to think about your words. I also will say, though, I mean, Donald Trump just selected somebody for his vice presidential running mate who tweeted this. Today is not just some isolated incident, and this is after, of course, the tragedy that happened on Saturday. The central premise of the Biden campaign is that President Donald Trump is an authoritarian fascist who must be stopped at all costs. The rhetoric led directly to President Trump's attempted assassination. So, yes, I think we do always need to give people a bridge to do the right thing, and maybe this is a moment for that. But that is the person who has just joined the ticket with Donald Trump, and I think it's important not to forget that either.
And I think, the choice of J.D. Vance had not been announced when J.D. Vance tweeted that out. And so there was still a possibility, if we were going to have like a change of course here as a country, once he said Democrats did this, Democrats, the word there,
Joe Biden did
led
this.
directly to is the phrase that he used there, right? Once he said that and blamed it in a partisan way like that, there was an option in the Republican Party and in the Trump campaign to then not pick J.D. Vance.
But let's heed Joy's warning. Let's not memory hole who Trump is. It's probably why he picked him.
Yeah. It probably helped him.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know. Ari?
I would just add that why did this happen is a question that could be answered slowly through an investigation, or for a lot of people it doesn't matter. And we've referred to people who had it taken an hour or two that was political, which means they're actually outing themselves. And I would think that applies to some people on the right who wanted to immediately politicize this. And it also has applied to some statements I've seen from people on the left who rushed to look at this as caused by something. But from an investigative perspective, we don't have motive yet. Law enforcement's been on it for several days. We know they got the phone, and they don't feel in a position to tell us publicly that the phone has revealed motive. We have clues that are isolated. So he's a registered Republican, but he's made other types of political donations, and we don't have the full context on that. So I do think it's important to remember that what you said is true. Historically, most lone wolf assassinations do not matter that much as to motive over time.
Yeah.
It would matter if, hypothetically, someone was working in concert with a large organization or a foreign entity, or they were an espionage asset. Then the motive matters a lot because it's an act of war.
Right.
But with, what you said, Rachel, lone wolf attacks historically that use political violence, which often relate to mental illness or other sort of kook attitudes, may not ultimately matter. But that's one question, is why did this happen? Can we figure that out? And then the other vantage point is, why does this happen so much in America? And there's a security failure question for the Secret Service, which has not so far been very forthcoming. And this is a massive failure. Someone tried to shoot a former president in the head.
Hey there, MSNBC fans. I'm Luke Russert, and be sure to join me, Rachel Maddow, Jen Psaki, Lawrence O'Donnell, Steve Kornacki, Joy Reid, and many more September 7th in Brooklyn. MSNBC Live Democracy 2024. Click on the link for ticket information. We will see you there.